Trump and populism. Those two words carry so much weight in American politics that even before we begin, you can feel the tension in the room shift. Not because this is a story about one man or even one movement, but because it forces all of us to confront a deeper, far more unsettling truth about what's happening inside our democracy. And as I sit here tonight thinking about the 2026 midterms on the horizon, thinking about the voters who feel unheard, the institutions under pressure, and the narratives shaping public life, I want to take you somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the daily noise, to examine something larger, quieter, and more consequential. How populism, energized and amplified by Donald Trump, is transforming democratic processes and reshaping voter behavior in ways we cannot afford to ignore. Because if we're going to understand this moment, we're going to understand the emotional power, the strategic power, the electoral power of populism, I have to start not with politics, but with people, real people. Americans who for years felt left behind by globalization, by technological change, by cultural shifts that seemed to accelerate overnight then. Americans who watched their towns hollow out their jobs, disappear, their institutions fail to deliver, and their leaders speak in polished, sanitized language that never quite reached their reality. For many of them, politics wasn't just broken. It felt draped against their interests, their values, their future. And when people reach that breaking point, when trust collapses and cynicism becomes a coping mechanism, they don't look for nuance. They don't look for carefully balanced answers or bipartisan solutions. They look for a voice, a loud, unapologetic, unfiltered voice, willing to say what others won't, willing to blame, who others can't, willing to promise what others don't dare. Populism thrives in that environment, feeds off that environment, grows stronger in that environment. But what happened with Trump wasn't just populism filling a vacuum. It was populism colliding with a country already strained by political polarization, economic inequality, cultural fragmentation, and a rapidly changing information ecosystem. It was a spark landing on a field already dry. Trump didn't invent populist anger, harnessed it, weaponized it, and then rebranded it as a political identity powerful enough to redefine an entire party and fracture the nation's democratic norms. To understand how this reshaped democratic processes, we had to trace the mechanics of populism itself, how it reframes conflict, how it reshapes narratives of legitimacy, how it presents politics not as a competition of ideas, but as a battle between the real people and the corrupt elite. That framing is not incidental, it is structural. Once you divide society into those two campsites, you declare that one group speaks for the people and the other group speaks for the establishment. Every democratic safeguard becomes not a neutral institution, but an obstacle standing in the way of the people's will. Judges become enemies of democracy. Journalists become enemies of truth. Civil servants become saboteurs. Elections become battlegrounds not for persuasion, but for existential victory. And that shift doesn't stay isolated within rallies or campaign speeches. It seeps in democratic processes in ways subtle and profound. Rule of law begins to bend under pressure. Norms that once held the system together, conceding elections, respecting judicial authority, accepting institutional constraints, start to erode. And in that erosion, populism finds its greatest power. Because populism is most effective, not when institutions are strong, but when they are vulnerable, when people already feel disillusioned with government, when trust is low, when polarization is high, when fear is widespread. No? And what does this do to voter behavior? It transforms it. Populism, especially in the form Trump deployed, doesn't just mobilize voters, it redefines how they think about voting itself. It turns elections into moral tests. It turns political loyalty into a statement of identity. It creates a sense of belonging, of grievance, of purpose. It promises a community built not through shared policy preferences, but through shared emotion, shared resentment, shared defiance of a system perceived as broken. But here's the deeper truth. Populism doesn't just reshape how people vote. It reshapes why they vote. Under traditional democratic politics, voters make choices based on values, interests, or assessments of governance. Under populism, voting becomes something closer to tribal affirmation, a way to declare allegiance, to reject the system, to punish perceived elites. And in that environment, facts become negotiable, truth becomes malleable, and political leaders gain permission from their followers to push the boundaries of democratic norms in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Now I want you to notice something about this transformation because it's subtle but critically important. Populism doesn't rise solely because of what its leader says. It rises because of what its audience feels. See, every successful populist movement, whether in the US, Europe, Latin America, or elsewhere, begins not with ideology but with emotion. Anger, fear, resentment, alienation. And Trump understood those emotions intuitively. He recognized the anger at declining trust in institutions. He recognized the fear of rapid cultural change. He recognized the resentment toward political correctness, media narratives, and perceived elitism. And he transformed those emotions into political capital. So tonight, as we examine the impact of Trump and populism on democratic processes and voter behavior, I want to take you deeper into that emotional architecture, that psychological framework, because the story of populism is not a story told in statistics or election maps alone. It's a story told in identity, community, grievance, and belonging. And if we're going to understand the stakes, not just for 2026, not just for the next election cycle, but for the future of American democracy, has to the emotional engine driving this movement. And make no mistake, the stakes are real. Because when populism begins to define voting behavior, when it begins to delegitimize institutions, when it transforms politics from a contest of ideas into a struggle for domination, democracies don't collapse overnight. They erode gradually, subtly, often unnoticed until it's too late. If we're going to understand how populism reshapes democratic life, we need to shift from the emotional foundations to the structural consequences. Movements powered by emotion don't stop at rallies or campaign slogans. Slogans, they spill into the machinery of democracy itself. And when the machinery has already been grinding under strain, even subtle shifts can create long-term fractures. So let's step back for a moment and look at the institutional stress points where populism, especially Trump-era populism, has exerted the greatest pressure, and where democratic processes have begun to warp in response. Start with elections. Not the campaigns, not the ads, not the televised debates, but the actual nuts and bolts. The certification boards, the polling locations, the secretaries of state who count the votes. These are the parts of the system most Americans never think about because for generations they quietly worked. But populism disrupts that quiet. It rewrites the meaning of elections. Instead of elections being a procedure, they become a battlefield. Instead of being a neutral process, they become evidence for or against betrayal. And once a leader tells his supporters that the system cannot be trusted, that the process is rigged unless he wins something, profound shifts deep inside the democratic psyche. Trust isn't just eroded, it is replaced. And what fills that vacuum? Loyalty. Loyalty to a leader. Loyalty to a narrative, loyalty to an identity that transcends the legitimacy of institutions. That's why we saw so many Americans in the aftermath of the 2020 election believing claims that had no factual base, not because they were duped, but because populism had conditioned them to treat institutional outcomes as secondary to emotional truths. Once that psychological shift takes root, voting stops being a civic act and becomes a declaration of defiance. And that defiance doesn't end when the votes are counted. It spills into governance. Think about Congress, which for years struggled under partisanship, but still maintains some functional norms. Populism disrupts those norms by rewarding conflict and punishing compromise. When a political movement frames elites as enemies, any attempt at bipartisan cooperation becomes suspect. Legislators fear primary challengers more than they fear legislative failure. And so the quiet, complicated art of governing is replaced with public displays of loyalty, theatrical opposition, and the constant performance of grievance. That performance isn't a side effect of populism, it's the point. Because populism thrives on the idea that systems are corrupt, that only confrontation can reveal their flaws. Now think about the courts. For a democracy, the function people have to believe that legal decisions, even the ones they don't like, are legitimate. Populism undermines that belief by framing judges as political actors. And once a leader convinces supporters that the judiciary is part of the so-called elite establishment, every ruling becomes another battle and a war against the people's will. This not only delegitimizes specific judges, it delegitimizes the very idea of rule of law. And you can see the consequences in how segments of the electorate now describe court rulings, not as decisions rooted in law, but as attacks orchestrated by adversaries. Then there's the media. For centuries, democratic societies have relied on independent journalism to hold power accountable. Populism flips the narrative. Instead of the press being a check on authority, the press becomes part of the enemy class. And when a leader tells millions of people that reporters are not just biased, but corrupt, not just mistaken, but malicious, not just adversarial, but dangerous, then truth becomes something voters choose based on identity, not evidence. Once that happens, democratic discourse, debate, persuasion, compromise becomes almost impossible. Because when every fact is filtered through partisan identity, facts themselves lose their binding power. And yes, we have to talk about political violence there, because while populism doesn't always lead to violence, it creates the conditions for it. When a leader tells people that the system is broken, that institutions can't be trusted, that political opponents aren't just wrong, but dangerous, that elections are stolen, that the country is under threat from within, some percentage of followers will interpret that as a call to action. Not because they are violent by nature, but because populism tells them that extraordinary threats require extraordinary responses. That's how democratic systems begin to weaken, from the edges inward, from the rhetoric downward, from the emotional to the structural. But let's not pretend this is only about institutions. This is also about who voters think they are. Populism reshapes identity in ways that outlast election cycles. It doesn't just tell people what to believe. It tells them who they are in relation to everyone else. And that identity becomes a political home. Once someone has adopted a populist identity, political persuasion becomes incredibly difficult. Facts don't easily penetrate. Policies don't easily shift allegiances, because the allegiance isn't to ideas, it's to a community. And if you want to understand the durability of Trump's influence, that's where the answer lives. He gave millions of Americans a political home they felt had been denied to them for years. A home built not on policy consistency or ideological purity, but on loyalty, grievance, cultural defiance, and emotional validation. And when people find a home like faith, especially after years of disillusionment, they don't leave it because of fact checks or op-eds or institutional warnings. They leave only if something in the emotional architecture cracks. So tonight, as we continue examining Trump and populism's impact on democratic processes and voter behavior, understand this. The system is not simply experiencing policy disagreements or ideological divides. It is experiencing a transformation of political identity, trust, legitimacy, and truth itself. And that transformation is reshaping not just how people vote, but how they understand democracy. And unless we confront that shift honestly, we risk misdiagnosing the moment we are living through and misjudging what it will take to repair the democratic fabric once the populist wave eventually recedes. To really grasp the full impact of Trump-era populism, we have to step into the terrain where politics and psychology meet, where voter behavior is not simply about preference, but about perception, belonging, and meaning. Because in a democracy, the rules matter, yes. The institutions matter, absolutely. But at the end of the day, democracy lives or dies in the minds of its citizens. And when the psychological foundations shift, the political foundations follow. The rise of Trump-era populism didn't happen because millions of Americans suddenly became more extreme or more ideological. It happened because millions of Americans felt something change inside them. A sense of loss, a sense of humiliation, a sense of being talked down to dismissed, forgotten. Populism wasn't the cause of that feeling. It was the language that finally gave it shape. It said out loud what people felt internally. And when you give someone a vocabulary for their pain, you earn their loyalty. Not because your solutions are perfect, but because you validated their experience. That validation is one of the most powerful forces in politics. It's also one of the most underestimated. Politicians often assume that voters respond to arguments, data, and policy proposals. But voters respond first to recognition. You see me, you hear me, you understand me. And Trump, whatever else one may argue, understood this instinctively. He turned politics into a performance of emotional recognition. And as a result, he rebuilt the relationship between leader and follower in a way that traditional politicians were completely unprepared for. Now, this emotional bond matters deeply when we're trying to understand voter behavior. Because once a leader becomes the vessel through which millions of people articulate their grievances, every criticism of that leader feels to his supporters like a criticism of them. That's why fact checks don't land. That's why legal investigations often strengthen loyalty rather than weaken it. That's why policy failures don't necessarily erode support. The bond is not transactional. It is personal. It is tribal. And tribes don't fracture because of data points. They fracture only when the emotional center of gravity shifts. But here's something even more significant. Populism changes how voters interpret reality. It does this through a simple but powerful psychological mechanism called the selective trust. In a populist system, trust is no longer distributed across institutions. It is concentrated in a single figure or movement. And when trust collapses everywhere else, the world begins to reorganize itself around that single source of perceived truth. That reorganization affects not only how voters understand politics, but how they understand society itself. Think about what happens when a leader repeatedly says the media lies, courts are rigged, elections are stolen, experts are incompetent, bureaucrats are corrupt, opponents are enemies. Over time, a new mental map forms. On that map, institutions are threats, elites are predators, and the leader is the only reliable narrator. And when people internalize this map, their political choices follow naturally. They are no longer choosing between candidates. They are choosing between worlds. And that's why populism is so effective, because it doesn't merely ask voters to select the leader. It asks them to select the reality. So let's talk about community, because this may be the most overlooked part of the story. Populism creates a sense of belonging for people who felt politically homeless. This is not the traditional kind of community built around geography, culture, or shared experience. This is a digital, emotional, often symbolic community built around shared outrage and common enemies. And in an age of social media, that community is constantly reinforced through content, commentary, and algorithmic feedback loops. Every video, every meme, every rally clip, every conflict becomes fuel for identity, fuel for loyalty, fuel for continued political engagement. This has enormous implications for voter behavior, because once voters see themselves as part of a political tribe or cause, they don't evaluate candidates. They defend them. They don't analyze policy. They affirm identity. They don't weigh evidence. They protect the narrative that gives their community meaning. And this is where democratic processes begin to strain, not because people no longer care about democracy, but because the meaning of democracy itself becomes contested. For many populist voters, democracy becomes synonymous with their leader's success. If he wins, democracy worked. If he loses, democracy was stolen. That's the danger in personalizing politics too deeply. Institutional legitimacy is replaced by leader legitimacy. And when that happens, the peaceful transfer of power becomes not a democratic ritual, but a test of loyalty. Elections become moral judgments. Opposition becomes betrayal. But let's step back for a moment and look not only at the dangers, but also at the underlying forces that made this moment possible. Because if we fail to understand those forces, we risk treating symptoms instead of causes. The first force is economic displacement, decades of wage stagnation, automation, job outsourcing, and the hollowing out of local industries. Populism thrives wherever the economic ladder seems broken. The second is cultural displacement, rapid demographic change, shifts in social norms, evolving definitions of identity, and a growing divide between urban and rural America. The third is institutional distrust, the legacy of financial crises, political scandals, broken promises, and bureaucratic failures. The fourth is information fragmentation, the collapse of shared news sources, and the rise of personalized narratives. Each of these forces existed long before Trump, But Trump took these forces and wove them into a narrative so emotionally potent that it redefined the political imagination for millions of people. Tonight, as we continue this analysis, understand this. Populism didn't create the fracture. It exposed it. And the future of democratic processes depends on whether we can repair that fracture without ignoring the emotional and psychological forces that made populism so powerful in the first place. As we move into the final part of this analysis, we have to confront the question that sits beneath every conversation about Trump populism and democracy. What happens next? Because understanding how we got here is only half of the story. The trajectory of the American experiment depends on how we interpret the consequences of this movement and how we respond to them. Populism is not a temporary political fever. It is a reflection of deep structural, emotional, and cultural forces. And those forces will continue shaping voter behavior long after Trump is no longer a central figure in American politics. So the real work now is to understand what those forces will mean for the future of democratic processes. The first truth we have to face is that American democracy has entered a period of contested legitimacy. That doesn't mean democracy is on the brink of collapse. It means that for a significant portion of the elected institutions are no longer neutral arbiters, but political actors. Whether we're talking about election boards, federal courts, the Department of Justice, or even local school boards, every institution is now interpreted through the lens of political loyalty. This is one of populism's most enduring legacies, the transformation of institutional trust into a partisan battlefield. And once institutional trust becomes partisan, the stability of democratic processes becomes vulnerable to emotional currents, rather than anchored in shared rules. But the second truth is equally important. Populism doesn't simply reject institutions. It seeks to replace them with alternative sources of authority rooted in identity, grievance, and charismatic leadership. For millions of voters, Trump became the embodiment of that alternative authority. He didn't just challenge norms. He redefined what it meant to represent the people. And that redefinition has reshaped voter behavior in ways that traditional political models weren't built to explain. Voters who once identified as moderates, independents, or disengaged citizens now see politics as a battlefield where their identity must be defended. This new form of voter psychology is not transactional. It is existential. Still, even as this transformation threatens the stability of democratic processes, it also reveals something important. Many Americans were living in a democracy that no longer felt responses to them. Populism filled the vacuum that traditional politics created. When political parties stopped speaking to voter frustration, populist leaders stepped in. When institutions became more technocratic and less relational, populist rhetoric became more emotional and more accessible. And when voters felt alienated by political language, populists replaced that language with something sharper, simpler, more visceral. This means that populism's rise is not just a story about democratic erosion. It is also a story about democratic neglect. And if the system is going to stabilize after this populist way, that won't be because people were convinced to abandon their beliefs. It won't be because the political system learned to reconnect with the emotional realities of the electorate. But there's another side to this story, one that often gets overlooked. Populism doesn't only change the behavior of its supporters, it also changes the behavior of its opponents. When one side of the political spectrum embraces populist rhetoric, the other side often responds with increased defensiveness, institutional protectionism, and exaggerated fears of collapse. That creates a feedback loop where both sides see each other not as fellow citizens, but as threats to national stability. And once that perception takes root, compromise becomes impossible. Politics becomes a zero-sum competition for survival. Democracy becomes strained not because voters disagree, but because they stop believing that disagreement is legitimate. This dynamic is already visible in voter turnout patterns and polarization metrics in the language people use when describing politics, and in the growing sense that democratic norms are fragile. But perhaps the most concerning shift is the way voters now interpret political loss. In healthy democracies, losing an election is disappointing, but it is accepted. In populist influence, democracy is losing becomes evidence of corruption, manipulation, or betrayal. And once voters believe that losing is illegitimate, the entire democratic process becomes unstable. Still, there is a path forward, but it requires grappling with populism honestly, without caricature, without denial, and without contempt. Populism exposes something essential about democratic societies. People need to feel heard. They need to feel respected. They need to feel represented. And when elections become detached from the lived experience of millions of citizens, those citizens will seek leaders who promise to tear the system down and rebuild it in their name. The future of American democracy depends on whether political leaders on all sides can restore a sense of legitimacy and belonging that is broader than any one movement. That means strengthening democratic processes in ways that feel transparent rather than technocratic. It means addressing economic dislocation not with slogans but with tangible local solutions. It means taking cultural anxiety seriously without weaponizing it. And it means rebuilding trust not through speeches, but through consistent, visible accountability. Because here's the truth that populism revealed. Democracy cannot survive on procedures alone. It needs emotional investment. It needs a shared narrative. It needs a sense of collective purpose. And right now, America is living through a moment where competing narratives are tearing at the democratic fabric. One narrative says the system is broken and corrupt. The other says the system is under attack and must be defended at all costs. Neither narrative leaves much space for the quiet, complicated work of democratic renewal. So what comes next will depend on whether we find a third narrative, one that acknowledges the failures that made populism possible, while rejecting the authoritarian impulses that populism can unleash. It will depend on whether citizens, leaders, and institutions can rebuild the trust that has been fractured. And it will depend on whether voters ultimately choose identity politics or inclusive politics, emotional narratives or shared reality, populist certainty, or democratic complexity. Because democracy is not simply a system of rules. It is a culture, a mindset, a shared belief in the legitimacy of disagreement. And the question before us now is whether that belief can survive an era shaped so profoundly by populist identity, charismatic loyalty, and the emotional power of grievance. If it can, then this moment will be remembered as a turning point, not a breaking point. And if it cannot, then the story of American populism will become a warning for democracies everywhere about what happens when trust collapses, when institutions weaken, and when identity becomes the only political currency that matters.